Welcome to the Half Stacks with Paul and Steph.
Your go-to podcast for tech jabber.
On today's episode,
Interviewing.
Steph. So, want to talk about interviewing?
Sure. Today's interview process is typically not realistic to the actual job. A lot of companies make you do leak code problems, and there are companies out there that want you to do these complex algorithms like graph theory or breadth first search or depth first search, and realistically you're probably not going to use that on the job. So I just feel you know it's kind of frustrating because you might not get that job opportunity if you don't do those things, even though those things have nothing to do with the job itself.
Oh god, yeah. It really, really sucks too because it kind of feels like you're on the spotlight when you're in the trying to figure out the algorithm portion, and it's not something that you use in your day to day work life. But it's like, why am I even doing this? And it's really it like grates on you after a while.
Yeah, and it's like when you don't use it in your day to day, you kind of have to brush up on it and practice it, and it becomes this major time investment into oh, I'm going to go practice my algorithms and leak code and all of this, and therefore it makes it a huge barrier to actually starting your job search, because
Yep.
you're like, oh well, I got to be ready for the coding interviews, but so I can't apply and take interviews until I'm ready. But because I'm still working my old job, I don't have as much time, and therefore you feel like, well, I'll never have time to prepare for interview, or at least it feels like that. Clearly, people have
I
different.
mean, I think no matter how you're starting your job search, whether you have a current job or you've been laid off, I think the stress of the interview process and whether it's the technical portion or non-technical, it can be so daunting that it's like really defeating to kind of go through the process.
Right. And I think not knowing what the question is going to be makes it more stressful. Like, I always like companies that kind of give you an idea, like, hey, it's going to be a leak code question, and it might be around, these these few things, right? Like, whatever we ask you will be in the range of these few, categories, because then it's like it's a realistic amount to prepare for, right? When they just say, oh yeah, lead code, practice your lead code, you're going to be expected to solve one or two problems, and it's like, okay, but I can't practice all of lead code, right? So the best you can do is you practice the several algorithms that might be required of lead code, and you just know how to apply it to a problem. But, I still don't find it realistic,
No, or I don't think it's a realistic process. But so let's say you're trying to kind of build up that motivation to start the process. Like, what things do you look at that say, hey, I need to start the process? Like, why are you looking at changing jobs, or is it a case of um, you're just testing the market? Like, what do you look at when you're kind of thinking about entering the interview process?
um I think that, every few years I try, but the amount I try varies, right? Like, if I see something interesting, I'll send in a resume and test the waters. And if I get rejected, that's the end of that try, right? It's like, oh, it was interesting, didn't work out for me. It's all good. I'll keep going on with life. But there are other cases, like maybe you just want a different maybe you just want a different problem space to be in, or a different environment. Like, right now the industry is really hostile in a way. A lot of companies are holding layoffs over their employees' head, which can create that hostility. It makes people work in fear rather than, in a good environment. A lot of companies are also cutting low performers. And, as I imagine, as a person that is looking for a new job or is at risk of being cut as a low performer, you're worried about the perception to your next company of like, how am I going to explain this to the next company I work for if they somehow line up the dates and say, "Oh, were you part of this layoff?" Right? Um, so yeah, reasons why you leave a company, you either find something more interesting, or you want to leave to try something new, or you want to leave a bad environment that has.
Yeah, I agree on all those points. The one addition I would say, or there's two additions I would say, is one, it kind of goes hand in hand with the whole like trying to find new challenges, which is always developing your skill set.
Yeah.
If you stay in the same company, whether it's, you can change divisions, but realistically, changing companies is really going to put new problems in front of you, but also new tech stacks. And so it broadens your skill set to kind of develop that.
Yeah.
I'm also a big believer in managing your resume, where, if you kind of are staying in the same position and either not changing companies or not being promoted, it probably is not the best thing on your resume. And so, kind of thinking of your career as your, kind of calling card. I don't know how else to put it, but having some sort of continual forward progression in your career is necessary to kind of make sure that, you're valuable in the market.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, a mistake, well, not really a mistake, but something I have done is try to remain at one company for too long. Or, because, you do get comfortable after a few years,
Oh
and
yeah.
when things work out, they work out, right? Uh, but what I am seeing is like other companies, especially like if you're working at a big tech company and you want to go to a smaller company, they'll often see you as stagnant or as someone that needs all the large tech company process and tooling in order to be able to work, right? And smaller companies are often more scrappy. They're trying to do with the bare minimum
Right.
because they don't have that sort of runway to build out all these processes. So, I think that, if you're at a large company, you also need to have a fair amount of other things you're doing to show that you're still progressing in your tech knowledge, right? Like you're not stagnant. Like large companies generally don't work with the latest technologies. So if you can find a project that uses the latest technologies just to demonstrate your skills, that's something that you can highlight to a recruiter or a hiring manager to show like, yeah, I worked at this company, but I'm totally just not about all the tooling they have. I build my own stuff as well. And from my experience, that has changed the perception of like how it seems, right?
Yeah, but I also think there's a way you can, even if you're at like a large company that has a tech stack that, maybe others don't, or maybe a little bit behind the times, you can also kind of spin that in your favor to say, even though I've kind of faced these really kind of opinionated tech stacks, or I, you know, had these like pipelines that kind of built and did everything for me, sometimes you have to work around those things rather than work with them, because your requirement in front of you says, hey, we need this, and that's a complete opposite of your tech stack. And so you could kind of highlight the skills of, hey, this is how I, got around this problem because I figured out I could do it this way instead of, using the technology to my advantage.
Yeah, I would say that's true, except when it comes to wanting to go to a new company where, your experience isn't relevant, right? Like, I quite enjoy writing Golang, but
Mhm.
in my day-to-day professional work, I write a lot of Java. So those two won't translate, right? So it's like if I really want to go to a company to write Golang, I have to show some sort of ability to be able to be proficient in that. And that's where a side project, like a substantial side project, not like a to-do app, but like that's where a substantial side project that you invest some time into can really work in your favor. It's like, oh, I haven't done this professionally, but I did, build out this separate project in my spare time. And, you could offer a demo of it, I suppose, or maybe just have a GitHub repo of all your work. But
Yep, makes sense.
um, but yeah, when was the last time
The
you
interview
interviewed?
process, like,
Oh,
let's talk about that portion.
the so typically it starts with a recruiter, right? And for large companies, they don't talk much about the company, which is weird, right? Like they'll assume that and they'll tell you more about like the role that you'll be going into or what they're looking for. And sometimes they don't tell you that. Sometimes they just jump right into like, okay, so, this is our compensation range. This is what our interview process looks like, right? It depends on the company, but I have seen multiple companies, large companies, not tell me anything about what the company's about or what the role is. And they'll like just dig into my resume and then tell me about all the logistics, right? So
Yeah, but I think that you also have to kind of view it as what the recruiter's job is, which
right.
is they're
I'm
there
trying
to
to
screen out candidates.
right.
And so they know, like, hey, these are the hit points where this candidate could leave. And so they're trying to get those out of the way first before
Yeah.
they're go further in with you.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, in general, I find that most recruiters will dig into your resume a little bit and then they'll talk about the logistics of like, oh, this is what our interview process looks like, you know, stuff like that. And then it goes to like typically like a technical round or three. Like some companies like a lot of technical rounds and some companies only do one. But that's where the whole frustration part comes in because the technical round isn't always something related to the job you will be doing, you know, like
Yeah.
Leak Code, for example, right? But, you know, I think there's a way to leverage Leak Code and have it be effective without without it being so stressful. You know, it's like it would be nice if companies could present like, hey, here are the things we would like to see you be able to do. Like give like a broad overview of like working with arrays or trees or just give like two or three areas for someone to focus in, right? But when they give out like, oh, we're going to be asking you leak code style questions, it's like, how am I supposed to prepare for that? It's like there's like over 3,000 leak code questions. How am I supposed to prepare for your specific leak code question, right?
Uh-huh.
Like if you're gonna ask me like a dynamic programming question, it's like give me an example of anywhere your company where that takes place. And I'm sure that's used in some companies. However, I think in most companies, for most roles, you're not using such things, right?
Right.
You're not doing leak code hard problems at most companies.
No. And or I kind of think it it kind of sets the interview process up for a negative experience, just
Right,
because it's kind of like it really does feel so defeating when you're doing the algorithm challenges. Like I really don't, or like I think there's some people who ace them and it's no problem for them.
right,
But I think the majority of engineers, and that includes good engineers, are just like, oh God, like why do I have to do this? It's not something that I have to, really think about in my day to day. And so all of a sudden to kind of be like, I have to prep for this portion that I hate anyway. And now you're already in a stressful situation of an interview.
right,
And, I think we've all been in those situations where you have either an interviewer or interviewers, um, and they're just kind of staring at you as you're trying to solve a problem and not really kind of talking to you at that point.
right,
And it's just like, what kind of thing is this? Like, because even in when you're faced with like the hardest problems, you generally go to your coworkers and be like, hey, what do you think of this?
yeah,
And you talk it through together. And so being in an interview where it's completely silent and you're just trying to explain how you're approaching the problem and the what's in front of you is so stressful.
yeah. Yeah, I've been on both sides of that table where I was the interviewee with the very quiet interviewer. And there are some quiet interviewers where if you start talking and showing them your thought process and asking them for validation or asking them questions of what do they think, they'll open up a little bit more, right? But then there are others that won't budge and they'll just wait for you to finish. And that is the scariest thing because that's like, that really makes you feel like they're judging you. Like when you get no feedback during an interview, like while you're working on a problem, I just find that the worst because that's like, okay, can you just like say something? Like you don't have to say good job, but just say, okay, where do you think you're gonna go with that? Like anything, right? Just say anything. Like just act like you care about what I'm doing and you're not just waiting for the end. Um, but I've also been the interviewer that was really quiet. And usually the quietness correlates to how much they're talking to me, right?
Mhm.
Like usually I don't try to remain quiet if they're trying to interact with me and involve me in their process. But if they're really quiet, it's like I have no way to know how to interact with you. And I can say things like, oh, try to think out loud, or, tell me your thought process behind solving this problem. And sometimes it's really hard for people to do that, you know?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
So
But
what do you think of like when it's the like technical algorithm challenge versus like a take home challenge? Like, do you view those things differently?
I think that I don't like take home challenges, but they're often more appropriate assessment of what like they're often more realistic than a leak code question,
No.
right? Like a take home challenge might be like, oh, build a small API for this and have it return these things, right? And it's like, there's good and bads, but at least it's realistic. It's like if you know how to build an app, you should be able to do whatever is in that challenge. Whereas, leak code is so arbitrary and it's like how much of it is actually going to apply in your day to day is the question, right? So it's like there's a major disadvantage with take home assessments, but I do think there are more fair way to assess someone. But if you have like 10 kids and a family to take care of, it can be hard to find the time outside of work and outside of your family to go and do that assessment, right?
Yeah.
So,
I kind of see it, from the interviewee side. I completely agree with you. They tend to be more real world based,
yeah,
so it's much easier to work on them. And obviously, like it actually is how you would code, where like, if you can't think of, oh, hey, what is this method that I need? You would go to Stack Overflow or MDN or
Yeah,
whatever, and figure it out. Whereas, in an interview process, it, you obviously can't do that.
right.
And so it's, a lot more stressful. But then I think, while it's a lot more beneficial for the interviewee, for the interviewer, it feels like, how do I know that that person actually did everything that they were supposed to?
Yeah, and I think there's ways around that. At a company I worked for over 10 years ago, probably 12 years ago, they didn't have coding assessments. What they did was a person would interview you, and if you passed that interview, they would hire you on.
Hmm.
So I only took one interview and then I got hired on, and there's like a probation period, and it's paid, right? Like I was paid for it, and it was like, okay, we have this real project that needs to be done, and we want you to do it, and like you can work with others and get help from others, but in that one, let's say it was like a 3-week period, it's like they see how you work, they see your code quality, they see, you know, they see what it's like to actually have you there, right? How
Right.
productive are you, your work ethics and all that. And I just think that's so much better of a way. I mean, granted, it takes more time, right? Than going through even like 5 rounds of interview is at most 5 hours of like face to face time. And then maybe like, half an hour to write up feedback or whatever. But, I think if you want a more realistic view of what kind of person and engineer someone is, just invite them to your office. And maybe you don't let them do a whole project. Maybe you work with them for a few days, right?
Hmm.
And then you can like more accurately decide, because someone can be really good at leak code or system design, and they can be really crappy to work with.
Oh yeah.
Like someone that's really good at algorithms might be one of those, super optimizers that wants to optimize all the things. And if depending on what kind of company you're in, you might not have the room to do that. You might have higher priorities, right? So there's always a trade-off. And even for like a take-home exercise, it's like if you think that the person didn't actually do the exercise, like then have them do the take-home, and then set up a interview where they walk you through it, and it becomes a system design interview about code they wrote. They tell you about the trade-offs and why they made certain decisions, right? And why did they structure it the way they did? And it becomes less hypothetical, right? Like they actually took the time to build out a thing, and they walk you through it. You can talk trade-offs, and then you at most have like 2 interviews at that point, and you covered a whole spectrum of things, right? So it's like there's just so many other ways to do it than, you know, leak coding all the time, right?
Yeah, because you touched on the whole kind of probation employment. So when you're looking for like positions, do you only go to employed, or do you look at like contracts as well? Because like that's kind of how I view contracting sometimes, is it's kind of like an easier way in because it's a looser employment
Yeah.
relationship.
I have done contracts as well. And contracts are being a contractor is much easier to get into
Mhm.
than getting in as an employee. And sometimes it can be to your advantage to start out as a contractor,
Yep.
because then if you're lucky, you might be converted to a full-time employee. And because you have built those relationships as a contractor, people generally already know what how you work. So even if you completely bomb an interview, they're probably still more likely to move you forward than if you were someone brand new, right? Um, but there's pros and cons to to the contract work, which is like you bring in a level of instability into your life
Yeah.
because it can be very short term. But then you also, the advantage of it is that you also are able to like control more of what kind of experience you're going to get, right? Like generally when you go and interview to become a full-time employee for a company, they have predestined your fate there, right? Like they're going to tell you what project you're going to work on, what tech stack you're going to use and all this. And that's fine. But when you're a contractor, you're like, okay, I'm going to do this for say 4 months and I'm going to gain all this experience in their tech stack, whatever they want me to use. And
Yep.
when I'm done, and I can go and find other contracts elsewhere dealing with other technologies, right? So it's kind of like speed dating for jobs.
Exactly. Or I think it's a case of, I think some people kind of view them as equals, where like they kind of want to develop that same relationship of as an employee where it's kind of more permanent. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, you have to look at this as a stepping stone and that's it. Like you can end the relationship at any point and they can end the relationship at any point.
Yeah. Now, the reasons why someone might not want to become a contractor is that historically, at larger companies, they're not treated very well. I've been a contractor at large companies and I've never experienced that. But, it
There, well,
varies
I
on the team and who it is and what you're doing and all that.
Yeah, or so I have previously entered companies where I wasn't, or I was a contractor, but then became full time.
Mm.
But after becoming full time, they changed how like contracts were set up and the environment, and it can be really like challenging to work as a contractor because
Yeah,
for them they couldn't just use their laptop. They had to basically log into a virtual machine, and virtual machines are much slower to build on.
yeah,
And so, I can understand, yes, there are security concerns and all these things that you're trying to manage in that relationship. But, you know, contracting to me has to be thought of in a certain way. And so just as long as you're going in with that mindset, I think that, it works for some people.
yeah. You also have to be careful when you're becoming a contractor, especially if you've never been a contractor before. Like you're not on payroll, right? Like to the company, you are a vendor that's providing services. And therefore, you have to read your contract very carefully because if you're expecting a weekly paycheck, that might not be the case because they can have certain terms like, oh, it's a net 60, in
Yeah.
which case you might not be paid for like 60 days. And if you're not aware of that, it can catch you off guard, right? So, and there's always a company that won't pay the contractor on time. Like I've been in those situations. It sucks to have to chase people down for money, but it's just something to be aware of when you're looking at being a contractor.
Yeah.
I think the best kind of contracting to do is to go through an agency that will hire you as a W-2
Yep.
and contract you out to other companies, but you're still fundamentally a W-2 employee for someone,
Yeah.
right?
And you kind of have to develop your relationship with that company rather than your actual employer.
Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. It's a big world and small world.
So how do you go about prepping for interviewing?
Uh, Realistically, I start building a side project that I'm really into, and then as the days tick on down, I start thinking about, oh man, I really got to do some leak code. I really got to do some leak code. I really got to brush up on system design. And then the last few hours are like, I'm cramming so hard. That's realistically what I do. And it's not a good system to prep on. Uh, but I think if I were an employer, okay, if I were an employer and I knew someone was looking for a job and they chose to do side projects that were interesting and, not building to a do apps, but actually like actual like substantial side projects. If they were like, oh, I chose to do side projects over leak code, it's like that actually shows like someone wants to build things, right? Like,
Mhm.
would you rather have someone spend all day leak coding or work with someone that actually enjoys building, right? Like, I mean, I might be selling myself here, but it's true, right? Like, and then you can take that side project and you're like, all right, you built this. It's a lot of work. Walk me through it. Why did you do this? Why'd you do that? You see their code, right? And, you know, I just think that there's just better ways than leak code, like quite honestly.
I completely agree in how to prep. Um, my biggest prep is I usually like research the company and kind of try to find out certain things about them to bring into
Do you do the
interviews.
leak code process?
But I do the same exact thing as you, as I procrastinate and procrastinate until like it's the very last minute, and I'm like, oh, I guess I should do some algorithm prep just in case. And
Yeah.
then I do a whole bunch of cramming, and then I'm like, the minute I stop looking at it, I'm like, oh wait, what did I just learn?
Now, people do say like instead of like grinding leak code all the time, you just take the interviews that you don't really care for
Mhm.
and you see what questions they ask you, right? And
Yeah,
you kind of practice through interviewing. And that also gives you a way to talk through the problem, practice voicing your thoughts and all that. Um, it's
yeah,
not
I
something
think.
I've considered doing because I'm generally really good at voicing thoughts while interviewing. So,
Oh no, I'm the complete opposite of
are you a
some,
quiet interviewer?
or not, or it depends. If I'm really like stuck or challenged, then I kind of like shut down, and then so yeah, I get quiet. So if the problem's just way too above my head, I tend to be like, okay, I'm screwed. What am I doing here? I'm wasting these people's time.
Well, I have read I have read that, it's better to talk through what you're stuck on than to shut down, right?
Oh
It's
no, it definitely is. There, I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's my normal like how I kind of react to the stress situation of it.
yeah,
Um, but the actual, so usually I do what you're saying is basically like I kind of go into the interview process where I want a couple of throwaway positions where I'm not really interested in the
yeah,
position, but it's more priming me for okay, you're kind of going through the technical sessions,
yeah,
and then hopefully that kind of opens me up to when I actually go for the positions I want that I'm better placed.
yeah, yeah. I mean, nothing is worse than grinding leak code on your own, right?
Oh yeah.
Like for me, I rather grind leak code with someone else and like have a conversation about it than to sit and like do it by myself. But if you have to do it by yourself, I would highly recommend Neat Code, not
Okay.
sponsored. This full disclosure, not sponsored, but I do have a lifetime premium subscription. I think he calls it pro subscription. Uh, because he lists out all the interview questions that are likely to be asked, right?
Hmm.
And he has YouTube videos that will show you how to solve it and the thinking behind it. Like it's very visual, like he draws it out and everything. And you kind of get to know, like, okay, so this is how he thinks of it, this is how he solves it. So if you have to do it by yourself, it's like at least he'll keep you somewhat company and show you the way of how to solve a problem, right? You're not going to be sitting there stuck for hours being like, I have no idea what to do here, right? So I would say when it comes to elite coding, it's like, don't let yourself get stuck. It's like, if you really just don't know, instead of wasting time trying to figure it out after a little bit, let's say you spent like 15 minutes on a problem, you can't solve it. It's like just go look at the answer and learn what you need to learn, and then go do a similar problem by yourself and see if you can solve it again, right?
Right.
Like I
I also
think the
think,
biggest challenge of leak code isn't solving the problem, it's knowing which algorithm to apply to solve it,
yeah, that makes sense.
right?
I think that there's also a certain amount of benefit in walking away from a situation, meaning like doing what you just said of, getting stuck, seeing what the answer is,
Yeah,
walking away for a while, let it leave your mind, and then try again and see
right.
like keep reapplying what you're learning, and so that way eventually drills in.
Yeah, and for me in particular, it's like sometimes endless coding doesn't really work, right? It's like if I'm doing a lot of leak code questions, it's like sometimes just following along with the video doesn't really work. Like sometimes I actually have to like write out the steps on pen and paper and like actually like digest the how, right? Instead of trying to memorize the solution, it's like I'm trying to just understand the how really well, because usually it's like when you're experienced enough, when you know, like, all right, to get from point A to point B, this is all the stuff you need to do. You can kind of walk through it and you'll be like, oh, okay. So first I need to do this. How do I programmatically do this? Okay, I've done that. How can I do this next? Right. So sometimes the answer isn't even to do more leak coding. Sometimes it's like take a leak code problem, understand how to break down the problem, how to solve those individual steps, and that way you can apply that thinking across all problems, and therefore you're not grinding out 3,000 leak code questions in a week,
Yeah.
right? That's not actually possible, I don't think, grinding 3,000. Yeah.
Thankfully not.
Unless you could solve any leak code problem, you probably can't grind all 3,000 in a week. I think if I did it long enough, like if I
Yeah,
practice.
you would actually try long enough. I know.
Oh man,
That's
challenge
insane.
accepted. I don't have the time to do 3,000 leak code problems.
Yeah, but you would see it as a challenge
I
that,
would see it as a challenge. Oh man, and we're
yeah,
recording this, so
your eyes will
now
be
it's
like,
on.
oh, yay.
How many actual leak code problems are there? Yeah, just an easy 3,500 problems. No big deal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
so
could do that in your spare time.
there's only 873 easy problems, 1,800 mediums, and 823 hard problems. So the bulk of what you'll be doing is medium problems. This probably gives a lot of insight into interviews. It's like, okay, don't think about, oh, are they going to ask a hard or medium questions? If you study medium questions, by definition of the problem breakdown, you will most likely get a medium question because most of the questions are medium, right? About half are medium and half are between easy and hard, right?
Okay.
So if you only focus on medium, you'll probably have the skill set to do an easy question,
Mhm.
and you might have to push yourself just a little bit to do the hard questions. Oh man, I just have this epiphany right now, and I'm just like, why didn't I think of this before?
Let's kind of think of, or so we kind of covered the algorithm portion and technical portions. What else, or is there anything else you would consider for prepping?
Um, the system design interview is often a discussion and maybe something like drawing on a whiteboard or in like a ScalaDraw or something.
Mhm.
So typically what they're looking for in that sort of interview is to come up with a strategy to build a system, be able to talk about your approach. Why did you choose the technologies that you chose? All the trade-offs, right? And like schema design. And I don't know if they do this for front end
They
problem.
do.
Oh, they do? Okay, cool. So
Or
then,
I mean, to me, or I think they kind of focus a little bit on the front end portion.
Yeah,
where they want you to think out how you would design the front end. But to me, it's just as important to know what you would do in the front end as what would happen in the back end.
yeah,
As if you don't have that understanding of back end challenges and ways to potentially correct it,
yeah,
how is it that you can really have the language to talk to your back end engineer to be like, hey, what about this?
yeah. And, for prepping for a system design, I don't think there's any better prep than real life experience, to be honest. But short of that, you can read a lot of case studies. And, it's like a classic one is like build a URL shortener, right? And
Mhm.
that can be done in many ways. And it's like, even if you just go on YouTube and listen to how other people solve it, you'll get about a dozen different solutions. And if you're like, okay, I have a dozen answers, which one do I go with in this interview? It's like you have to go and do your own research, like, oh, why would you choose this over that? You know, do you use caching or do you not? Right.
Right.
So I would say that the system design is almost easier to study for
Okay. Yeah.
because you just have to understand some core technologies and the pros and cons of using them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also touches more on it's more real world based
Right.
because it's always, something that, you know, kind of build a mini application of what we already do or build whatever this company does. How would
Yeah.
you design that system? And so even if it doesn't always fit that company, it at least makes sense.
Right. And there's so many resources out there and like YouTube videos that, will talk about all the pros and cons of different systems. So I feel like the system design information is more within reach and easier to understand.
Hmm.
Whereas like algorithms, it's like, it might take a while for someone to really grasp how to use an algorithm,
Yeah.
especially for the more complicated things, right? Um, but yeah, system design, and then there's like behavior and cultural fit, which, if you're an easy person to get along to with, you
I
can,
wouldn't discount the cultural fit portion though either, because I think, it depends where you are and what or the reason for being in the market.
yeah,
But kind of figuring out, hey, does this company kind of work to how I like to work means a lot.
yeah,
Um, and the other portion is, depending on who you're talking to in the interview, you know, whether it's kind of like if you're going to be talking to other engineers, finding out what the work experience is really important because you are going to be developing a relationship with this next employer and kind of finding out ahead of time, oh, I may not fit how they work is a big thing.
yeah,
And then if you're talking more towards the recruiters, not or being really comfortable to ask the questions of, is the benefits package going to match what I'm currently at or what I want? Because that could be a really difficult portion as well, is asking for you know more is always hard, like because
yeah,
it's always a question of feeling like, do I really deserve this, like I'm doing something wrong by asking for this, and it's like, no, this is a business,
yeah.
they're
And,
that's a
one
relationship.
thing that recruiters especially will ask a lot is like, what are your expectations for salary? Right.
Hmm.
And um I always deflect because if you give a number of your expectation, or I always try to deflect, but if you give a number of your expectation, it kind of sets you up for that, right? Or it can eliminate you entirely if it's not within their budget. But I always deflect and I always say, I'm more looking for the right role. Do you have a band that you can give me for what this entails?
Okay.
Right? and then I can evaluate if it's the right thing for me. And my thinking might be a little different, which is like, if I really like the company, I'm willing to take a small cut in compensation to work there, right? But at the same time, I have my minimum. It's like,
Exactly.
this is my minimum. I'm not gonna tell the recruiter what my minimum is, because I want to see what the company is gonna offer, right? Because if you come in too low by setting a number out there, they're gonna come in too low too. They're like, oh, this person's under our budget. We can save lots of money just by hiring this person. And they won't, it closes off a lot of the negotiation part, is what I,
Yeah, and this is more towards later portions of the interview process, but also finding out, if you're getting that offer, where that offer line lies in the band.
right,
Because if you're getting hired, at the top end of their band, you know, it's going to be hard to get raises, or you may be stagnant unless you go the promotion route. And so making sure that, everyone has the right expectations going in.
yeah, yeah, I agree. I think, when it comes to pay, it's always a little touchy because, you want a fair amount. But then you also have to understand, like, depending on what company you're coming from and what company you're going to, you might have to adjust your own expectations, right? Like,
You know,
if you're coming from a large company where you get RSUs and a really decent salary, and you're going to a startup, just understand, like, you might not have your premium health care. You might instead have an HSA. You might not have RSU. You probably will not have RSUs in a startup. You'll just get equity, which will become substantial if they're able to make something happen.
but you also have to go into with the mindset of, because you're getting, if you're looking at the equity package and being like, oh, I'm going to have to pay for portions of the stock
Right.
and that kind of thing, be very aware of that,
Yeah.
because it can cost you in the end if
Yeah.
you don't quite understand it. Make sure that you've done the research to understand it,
Right.
um because like, I've been in situations in the past where I kind of went in blind being like, oh, that sounds great to me, and then finding out afterwards, oh, that actually didn't work to my benefit. So
Yeah. Yeah. You have to have the right expectations for the right company. They're not always going to be able to match what you have, right? Like, especially in terms of like healthcare and like time off or stuff like that. But
sometimes that's okay. Like, sometimes if you're really passionate about what the company does and you want to
yeah,
be a part of it, and you make the choice that, hey, I'm okay kind of taking a lower, or taking a cut for this, you know fine, but just make sure that you're aware of it.
I think for anyone that is interviewing, I think the best prep is to just go through some interviews where if you lose the opportunity, you're okay with it.
Yeah.
And if you gain an opportunity, like, it's up to you, like, if you want to take it or not. Like, you might actually just do better than what you think, right? I think that's the only real way you can prepare, because it's like, you can leak code all you want or research system design all you want, but there's something about interviewing where you're just probably going to blank out on everything that you've studied.
Oh yeah, definitely.
uh so I don't know, you have any last tips?
No, I think we did covered a lot.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll see you, Paul.
Till next time.